Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Richards, Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. This is being delivered by AM Best on the subject of an update on AM Best's performance assessment for Delegated Underwriting Authority enterprises. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. Please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these will be asked and answered at the end of the event. If we run out of time, questions will be answered post-event. This presentation is accredited for CPD hours if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. The briefing is being recorded and a link to the recording will be issued post-event together with the slides and our feedback survey. Please take the time to complete our survey. It will take no longer than 2 minutes and allows us to deliver the best possible future events to our membership. So as a recap, today's briefing is on the subject of AM Best's performance assessment for Delegated Underwriting Authority enterprises from AM Best. I'd just like to run through the learning objectives for today's session. So at the end of this session, delegates will be able to summarise the 5 components of analysis in the AM Best performance assessment with the sub-factors in each category, explain how the overall performance assessment is developed, describe the performance assessment process and methodology, and outline the outcome of AM Best's initial performance assessments. So now let me introduce you to our presenters, Nick Charteris-Black and Miles Gould. Nick is Managing Director, Market Development, EMEA for AM Best. Nick joined AM Best in February 2008 and is responsible for the company's commercial development in Europe, Middle East and Africa, EMEA. This includes strategy, business development, client management, public relations and market research. Nick also has management responsibility for the company's representative office in Dubai and the development of AM Best's information services business in EMEA. Miles is Director, Credit Rating Criteria Research and Analytics for AM Best, based in London. Miles is currently the lead criteria contact for AM Best's performance assessment, PA, for Delegated Underwriting Authority enterprises, DUAE. So just before we kick off, I've been asked to point out that due to regulatory reasons, AM Best is unable to comment or discuss pricing and or fees for services during this call. AM Best would be happy to do so for interested parties on a bilateral basis via the contacts included at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, enjoy the briefing, everyone. And Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I was just wondering actually which of those 2 photographs look most out of date. So maybe we'll run an audience poll. But thanks again. Very good for everyone to join us. And also particular thanks to the MGAA for assisting us with this briefing. I think it's either the 3rd or 4th that we've done, either in person or remotely online, but it's very much appreciated the support that you have provided to us. So my comments are going to be relatively brief, but in terms of what we're going to cover during this session over the next hour, I've got a few introductory comments to make shortly, and then I'll pass over to Miles, who will run through at a pretty high level the scope and process of our performance assessment, the methodology and key assessment components, give you a little bit more colour around some of the published performance assessments that are out now in the public domain, and then just changing tack slightly to give an overview of our market segment outlook. We publish a market segment outlook on what we call the DUAE sector, so effectively the MGA sector, and also some comments on the fronting market where we are particularly involved as in our kind of credit rating agency capacity, rating, I think, really all the fronters in both the UK and the US markets. So Miles, we just move to the next slide. So just to start with, I wanted to sort of recap as to why now, why are we introducing this service now, or more accurately, why did we introduce it back in 2022? And there were a number of reasons, which I think probably familiar to most people now. But certainly, one observation was and we weren't obviously alone in that, the increasing role of MGAs in the insurance value distribution chain, and the fact that this was no longer a cyclical phenomenon. It was very much more a permanent part of the insurance ecosystem. And we saw this manifest itself particularly in our engagement with some of our major rated clients, with senior management, where part of the discussion as part of the rating process is about business profile and distribution. And the MGA topic was increasingly popping up in those discussions. So if nothing else, we needed to become more familiar with the sort of MGA source of distribution for rated carriers. From our perspective, we only operate in one sector, and that's the insurance sector, the insurance reinsurance sector. So it provides us with an opportunity to broaden our service offering in that sector and hopefully indeed provide a valued extra service to the sector. And finally, we were also observing an increasing interest from a number of major stakeholders, as it says on the slide, capacity providers, as in insurers, investors, brokers and regulators. A number of people were knocking on our door asking us what was our view of this increasing trend within the market. So just the next slide, please, Miles. So just to give a recap of our rollout, we're going back, I guess, 3 years now. So initially, following the process we adopt for introducing new credit rating criteria, we just be very clear, this is not a credit rating. As Miles will explain, we issued a draft methodology for comment in March of 2021 for feedback. And I think it's fair to say we did receive a considerable amount of feedback from a number of the industry stakeholders, which itself led to some changes. I mean, not a huge amount, but some changes in the draft methodology. And then we ran what we would so-called beta testing, where a number of MGA businesses kindly stepped forward to be effectively guinea pigs for us to run them through the process. It was as much to check the ability to provide the information that we needed, and also that MGAs, DUAEs were comfortable with the reports that we subsequently issue, which Miles referred to towards the back end of this presentation. So having done that consultation and the beta testing, the methodology was finally released in February of 2022, so just over 2 years ago. And we started issuing the first public assessments in April of 2022. One thing I will say before passing on to Miles, the methodology which I've referred to is a public document. Miles is going to be giving a very high-level overview of that, but anybody is free to read the full methodology, which is available on our website, which I think, again, Miles will touch on later on in the presentation. So with that, I will pass over to you, Miles.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Nick. So yeah, as has been briefly mentioned, the first part of this session from my side will just be to walk through at a relatively high level the scope and process when we're going about conducting a performance assessment for a delegated underwriting authority enterprise. So just as way of a brief recap, a performance assessment, from our perspective, is defined as a forward-looking, independent, and objective non-credit opinion, and this speaks to and is indicative of a DUAE's ability to perform services on behalf of its insurance partners. And also, just to recap, DUAE is a term that AM Best is using to cover a sort of blanket set of MGA and related enterprises. So as you'll be aware, the terminology most commonly used in the UK European market would be MGA. But if you move overseas, Australia, New Zealand, the US, this does introduce other nomenclature and legal entities which conduct similar activities to that of MGA. So as Nick alluded to, this methodology is global in nature, and therefore DUAE encompasses MGAs and related enterprises. So yeah, as we progress through the subsequent slides, I'll talk in a little bit more detail as to the assessment components that we look at. But at a high level, there are 5 assessment areas which we evaluate, and the overall analysis here leads to a view on the entity's performance, serviceability, and very importantly, alignment of interests in relation to business partners. Yeah, the scoring process is relatively straightforward. So yeah, a points scoring mechanism is used on each of the 5 components. Those points are summed together, and ultimately that determines the performance assessment that would be issued for a DUAE. So just to walk through in a bit more detail, what the process looks like, and the way I'd sort of preface this is that a DUAE entering the process for the first time, what would it look like in terms of the steps that we'd go through when evaluating the company and determining a performance assessment. So we'll walk through the chart on the right-hand side in a moment, but just before we do that, I think it's worth mentioning and pointing out that this is an interactive process, so it's not a desktop review based on only public information. We would be evaluating public information, but also information that we would obtain through a formal interaction with the assessed entity. And one of the key parts of that is a data collection by way of a supplemental performance assessment questionnaire, which, if you like, captures a range of data that we need, both quantitative and qualitative elements to conduct the performance assessment. And in addition to that, we also would hold a formal management meeting with the DUAE. And this is really an opportunity for the analytical team to get in front of the management team of the DUAE, understand the business model, the business strategy, and the business plan going forwards as well. So moving to the chart on the right-hand side, starting at the top, the very first sort of component of the process, if you like, is to gather that information that we need to conduct the assessment. So very early in the journey for a company going through this process, we would share a formal management meeting agenda. This would detail in a tailored fashion the key topics and areas that we would expect to discuss with the management team in the aforementioned management meeting, and we would also share that supplemental performance assessment questionnaire, which the DUAE would need to complete to give us that base set of information. So that's really the first part, and it's worth pointing out that the time frame associated with that does vary company to company, depending on the complexity of the entity, but also how readily available the information that we're looking for is. Some companies are able to turn that around quite quickly. For others, it takes a little bit longer to prepare that information. So moving on to step 2, this I guess we've already touched on, but this is what we refer to as the management meeting. As I mentioned, this would be attended by the senior management team of the DUAE and the analytical team from AM Best, and would be a dialogue around the assessment components and the business activities of the DUAE. Following this, it's really a case that AM Best then works through the information that's been received and conducts its analysis in order to proceed with determining the performance assessment. So the analytical team are primarily tasked with this particular step. The analytical team would prepare a recommendation, which then ultimately goes to an assessment committee, which is the body that determines the ultimate assessment. And then moving on to the next step, once an assessment has been determined, that outcome would be disseminated or shared with the DUAE management. There would be a dialogue in terms of explaining the strengths and weaknesses that led us to determine the outcome that we have. And we would also share draft documentation with the DUAE in the form of a press release and a more detailed performance assessment report. And then it's really over to the DUAE management team to contemplate that information, to go through the detail and make a decision on whether they would like to proceed with publishing the performance assessment, in which case we would publish the assessment on AM Best's website, along with a copy of the press release and the more detailed performance assessment report. Alternatively, DUAEs can opt to maintain the assessment on a private basis, or at this point, they could also choose to exit the process. So that's really a walkthrough at a high level of the process for a company going through the performance assessment for the very first time. Element 6 in this diagram, you might want to think about as the linking pin. So performance assessments, will typically be updated on an annual basis. So in the intervening period between completing the first assessment and then moving to the second year of assessment, the DUAE would be subject to ongoing monitoring. And what we mean by ongoing monitoring is really just surveilling the activities of the business to ensure that things are tracking in line with expectation. If something did materially move outside of expectation from a performance assessment perspective, this could lead us to go back to a committee to evaluate whether a change in assessment is needed. But assuming that's not the case, then the surveillance activities would be concluded, and we'd move back to the start of the process for the second round or second year of assessment. So that's really a walkthrough at a high level of what the process looks like. The next section of this presentation is then to provide a high-level recap, an overview of what the methodology and key assessment components are. So starting with the chart on the left-hand side, and as alluded to earlier, there are 5 key assessment components that we look at and evaluate in this process. It's important to highlight that within these, there are a number of subcomponents and elements which we'll come onto in the subsequent slides. And these cover a range of topics and areas, including both quantitative and qualitative aspects. So looking at the 5 assessment components: underwriting capabilities, governance and internal controls, financial condition, organizational talent, and depth and breadth of relationships. It's important to note that the first 3 assessment components carry a double the weight in the assessment process of the 2 final assessment components. And you can see this by the column headed max points in the table. So what this really reflects is the fact that underwriting capabilities, governance and internal controls, and financial condition, these are seen as more significant and integral elements that we need to consider when determining the overall PA. It's not to say that organizational talent and depth and breadth of relationships are not important, and it is possible for companies to score at the top end of the scale in those areas and score at lower levels in the higher weighted components. But the weighting is really intended to reflect the fact that those 3 key assessment components in AM Best view are critical in determining the overall performance assessment. So just to sort of run through an example at a high level, AM Best would evaluate each of those 5 assessment components. We would determine the points or the score for each of those, 1 to 5 on the lower weighted areas, and then 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 as the scoring framework for the higher weighted components. We would then sum together the points of each of those component areas, and this would then lead to the overall determination of the assessment symbol and category, which is shown in the right-hand table. So to give you an example, if the sum of those 5 components gets a company to an overall score of 30, if you look at the rightmost column, the right-hand table, that would give you an assessment symbol of PA2 with an assessment category keyword of excellent. And just to make it fully clear, PA1 is the higher end of the scoring framework through to PA5 at the lower end. And the assessment category keywords follow that as well, from exceptional through to weak. Okay, so the next two slides are intended to just give you a flavour of the subcomponents and elements that we look at when evaluating these five assessment areas. I'm not going to go through all of these today. I'm just going to pick out a couple of examples to give you a flavour of what we look at. And I would also just point out that whilst each of these areas are something that we would potentially evaluate for each of the DUAEs, in some circumstances, some of these areas will not be applicable depending on the individual business model and functions that a DUAE performs. So the way the methodology has been constructed is to give us the tools we need to evaluate all different shapes and sizes of DUAEs, conducting different functions, but we will utilize the elements of that methodology depending on the particular business model of individual DUAEs. So starting with underwriting capabilities, again, just as a reminder, one of the higher weighted components. This is an area where there are both quantitative and qualitative areas. I'll just pick out underwriting results as an example here. So we would look to understand the performance of the business underwritten by the MGA or DUAE. It's not a point in time view, so we'll be looking at historical experience and also forward-looking expectations. We'll be looking at loss ratios and combined ratios in particular. And we'll be looking at those in the context of what the targets are that have been set by the DUAE on a program by program or product by product basis. Also what the expectations are from a carrier perspective on the performance of individual programs, and also where applicable, look at that performance in the context of the positioning to peers as well. Just to pick out another example on underwriting capabilities, we'd seek to understand commission structures that are in place for the products and the DUAE at an overall level. Commission structures is a particular area of importance, as we see this as quite important from an alignment of interest perspective. We'd look to understand both the fixed and variable elements of commission structures, particularly with a focus on how does the commission structure incentivize balanced risk-taking and underwriting by the DUAE. So moving on from underwriting capabilities to governance and internal controls, this is an area which is a little bit more qualitative in nature. Again, you can see top of the list there is alignment of interests. In this particular assessment component, we're looking to understand how the structure of the DUAE, including stakeholder interests such as shareholders, carriers, brokers that may be involved or engaged with the DUAE, how the contractual arrangements are established to ensure alignment of interest through those different stakeholder lenses. We'd also look at things such as disaster recovery plans, key person risk, where key person risks are evident. We'd look to understand what mitigations a company puts in place and consider things such as succession planning. And then moving to the third and final higher weighted component, so financial condition. This is where we do more of a deep dive into the financial statements of the MGA or DUAE. And we're really looking to evaluate the sources and stability of income as a starting point. So what is driving the revenue streams of the DUAE? Is there a reliance on a particular program or set of programs, or is it a diversified book of business from an income and revenue perspective? We'd also look to understand debt and borrowings that the DUAE may have, and this is really in the context of evaluating leverage and coverage. So we do see borrowings as a component of some MGAs and DUAEs. And really, we're looking to understand the appetite for debt and leverage, and also how the income stream of the business supports the interest payment on any debt that an MGA or DUAE may have. And I'd also just point out here, so it's a bullet point a bit further down the list, but this is the area where we would consider the financial strength or weakness that may arrive may arise for the MGA in the context of related parties, and in particular a parent. So this is where we can give credit, if there is a particularly financially strong parent sitting above the MGA, and then there's a track record of financial support and financial flexibility, for example, this is something that could be considered favorably within this assessment component. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the assessment considerations across those first three components. The next slide follows a similar form. So just to walk through some of the considerations for organisational talent and depth and breadth of relationships. So organisational talent, I think it's really important to point out here that our analysis in this area is very much relative to the size and complexity of the business. And this recognises that we're evaluating DUAEs of all different shapes and sizes. And the composition and makeup of the talent that exists at a global MGA that operates in a number of different markets, perhaps with a range of different risk profile products as well, will look quite different from perhaps a single market, single product or single program focused DUAE. So for a larger organization that perhaps covers a range of complex risks, we may see experience in-house for sort of actuaries and pricing backgrounds, whereas for a smaller MGA that perhaps is not tasked with the pricing or reserving function related to the program that it's writing on behalf of carriers, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see that in-house experience and capability. This assessment component will also look at things such as what training programs does the MGA have in place to support the development of its staff, and also will include an evaluation of management expertise and the organizational structure. So moving to depth and breadth of relationships, this is an important area where, again, we're considering some qualitative and quantitative aspects. We'd look at the number of programs and markets that a DUAE operates in. Generally speaking, if we see diversification across program, markets, geography, this is something that is viewed favorably from an assessment perspective. And really what we're looking to dig into in that area is the sustainability of the business model in those relative areas. We'd look to understand the strength of distribution. Does the DUAE have a unique selling point or a competitive advantage that means it's able to execute its business plan with more certainty over a period of time? So that's a walkthrough of the 5 assessment components, and really just to sort of wrap up on that, our focus and attention in those various areas does vary depending on the company and the specific model that we're looking at, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of the key considerations. So the next section of the presentation is just to walk through some published examples of performance assessments. Nick alluded to this earlier, just for us to walk through some of the live cases that we have. So the first thing I'd point out is that, as we mentioned earlier, it's a global methodology, and I think this is already reflected in the universe of assessments that we have published. So you'll see on this slide and the next that we have MGAs and DUAEs assessed in the UK and European market. We also have MGAs assessed with operations in the US, Latin America, and also in Asia Pacific via New Zealand and Singapore. So it's good to see that already we've got a spectrum of DUAEs from different markets involved in the process and with published assessments. And I think this diversification also flows through when you look at the size scale of DUAEs that have entered the process, and also the lines of business that they operate in. So just to draw that out, we have some very large operations. Amwins on the left-hand side of this table is an example of that. So writing in excess of 3 billion of premium, focused in the US, but writing a wide variety of lines of business. And then towards the other end, and maybe more niche, smaller end of the spectrum, we have the likes of Cargo Risk Corp, that's writing just in excess of 10 million of premium, but very much focused in a particular line of business, which is marine cargo. And then in between that, we have a range of companies. Castell and Corin are obviously two MGAs that you'll be familiar with in the UK and European markets. Again, writing a variety of different lines of business. And this also flows through in terms of the performance assessments and outlooks that we've published. You can see it on this screen that we've already got a range of assessments. Amwins is at the top end of the scale with a PA1 exceptional, and then we've also got some PA2s and PA3s published as well. So the next slide is just an extension of this. As I mentioned, Delta International here. So this is an MGA operating in the Asia Pacific market, New Zealand and Singapore, and some other examples of US, Latin America, and Caribbean companies as well. It's also worth noting, again, different ownership structures. This is relevant perhaps for one of the later slides that I'll come on to. But we're seeing companies enter the process for a range of different reasons, and with a range of different business models and ownership structures as well. Okay, so this next slide is really just to highlight, as I mentioned in the process and an overview slide, that for these entities that have all been through the full process and received a performance assessment on a public basis, a press release which conveys the key assessment considerations is publicly available on our website. And if you follow this QR code on the screen, that will take you to our recent assessment activity page where you can find these press releases. And also, if you follow the links on that page, you'll also be able to obtain access to the performance assessment reports, which provide a little bit more detail in each of those 5 assessment areas as to the key assessment considerations and strengths and weaknesses that have led us to the overall performance assessment outcome. And it's important to note that both the press releases and the performance assessment reports are all freely available to interested parties. Okay, so the next section of this presentation is really just to share some visibility around AM Best's view on the DUAE market as a whole. As you may already be aware, AM Best as a commentator in the insurance industry more generally publishes on a routine basis market segment outlooks on a number of different markets, particularly on the insurance underwriting and sort of carrier side. But we have also released a market segment outlook on the global DUAE segment. So I'll walk through some of the tailwinds and headwinds that we see for DUAEs in a moment. And I'll also just provide a few comments around the fronting industry and the fronting industry's engagement with MGAs that's led to quite significant growth over recent years. Okay, so just walking through those tailwinds and headwinds that I mentioned. AM Best has had a DUAE segment outlook of positive for 2 years now. This was confirmed or maintained in our most recent review of late November 2023. So the overall market segment outlook from AM Best's perspective is positive. And this really reflects the strength of the tailwinds that we'll go into in a moment, whilst noting that there are some headwinds that are applicable to this segment as well, but really the tailwinds outstripping the headwinds in our view at present. So just touching on some of those tailwinds, the first one is very much around sustained growth and performance globally. I think if you look at the premium volumes of business transacted through MGAs, DUAEs, in markets where there is a prominent position from MGAs, you'll see that the trend over the last 3 to 5 years has certainly been one of growth in most instances. The US is absolutely leading the way on this, but it's also true that in UK and the London market, we've seen quite substantial growth in the business that's transacted through MGAs. And with that, we've gone through some changes, I guess, in terms of the market conditions. Soft and hard market elements have been seen over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think the growth that we've seen is really testament to MGAs evidencing their value and contribution to the insurance value chain, through those changes in cycle. So moving on to the other tailwinds, a key strength that we see from the DUAE segment is that ability to address underserved and emerging risks. We still believe that the MGA model is very much conducive to supporting insurers and risk carriers being able to ultimately provide capacity and products to be distributed in niche and underserved areas of business, along with emerging risk classes such as cyber, changes we've seen in some markets around D&O. MGAs are very much at the forefront of supporting the development and growth of emerging risk coverage. And underpinning all of this, and hopefully you can see that some of this links back to the assessment methodology that we've spoken through earlier. We see a key strength of the segment being very much around the execution of technology and leveraging of talent through the MGA model, which has supported growth in innovation, and really MGAs in many instances leveraging the combination of technology and talent in a fashion that's been conducive to growth, but also to product design and implementation that's been favorable for insurance partners backing a variety of MGAs. So looking on the other side of the coin at some of the headwinds, and whilst I mentioned, we do obviously see significant strengths coming from those tailwinds to support the overall positive outlook. It would be remiss not to think about the headwinds that we've seen in recent periods. So as we went through the most recent renewals and to some extent the year prior to that, we have seen a tightening of capacity in certain areas, and one that springs to mind is particularly property cat business. From an insurer-reinsurer perspective, we have seen tightening of capacity in some areas. So MGAs or DUAEs operating in that area may have been pressured a little bit more by those conditions, and something for us to continue to monitor going forwards. The second point is there has been some uncertainty in the fronting market. I have got one further slide to come on AM Best's view of the fronting market and platform businesses. But as I'm sure you'll be aware, as the fronting market has grown both in the US and in Europe, the rate of growth has led in some circumstances to challenges in the execution of risk management. And questions have been raised around governance and controls in some instances. So again, a topic or a headwind that warrants further monitoring. But fair to say we have seen some uncertainty in terms of the role and position of the fronting market. And finally, ongoing and evolving economic challenges. We're starting to see hopefully interest rates having reached a peak position, and will start to drop in response to declining inflation. But if you look at the last sort of 12 to 18 months, there's no getting away from the fact that inflation and interest rates has been a challenging consideration for many companies, and this very much extends to MGAs and DUAEs, particularly in the context of running costs, operational costs, including staffing, but where companies do have debt on the balance sheet, obviously interest rates have a bearing on that as well. So we see that as a headwind. Hopefully something that will abate as we move forwards, but again, something that will continue further monitoring, will require continued monitoring going forwards. So that's really an overview of AM Best view from a DUAE market segment outlook perspective. We typically update our segment outlooks on an annual basis, unless there are material changes in the intervening period. So if that's of interest to you, please do continue to look out for our market segment outlook updates. Okay, and the final slide from my side before we move to any Q&A is really just to introduce from our perspective a few thoughts on the expansion of fronters and platform businesses. And as Nick touched on earlier, AM Best via its credit rating activities, not the performance assessment activities, does work with a number of fronters in the context of providing them with credit ratings, and really just to hit on this very first reference on this slide, Conning, who's very much involved in MGA and program market commentary and surveys, in their 2023 analysis and report, the headline view from their side was that 45% of MGAs, part of that survey, were accessing capacity through a fronting carrier. And I think if you look at that trend currently as compared to 5+ years ago, it would have been a much smaller number 5 years ago, and it's certainly something that has become more integral to the MGA model in a number of cases. So hybrid fronters and platform businesses, it's important to point out that the names you can see listed at the bottom here, all have slightly different business models and service offerings, but sort of collectively evaluating this cohort, we have seen significant expansion in their activities over the past 2 years. So the US market in particular has been a driving force of this. We've seen fronting companies involved in managing licensing needs and enabling fronting of a business that perhaps the ultimate risk carrier wouldn't have a license to write without the fronting company in between, really supporting the growth of MGAs in the US market. And that trend has certainly flown through to the UK and Europe in some regards as well. You can see from the list here that we have a much smaller cohort of fronters in Europe as it stands. Bridgehaven is a relatively new entrant to the UK market, but still just 3 sort of headline fronters in the European market, compared to a much higher number in the US. So I think we just wanted to dovetail that into the presentation. We do see it as an important part of the market and the MGA model. We mentioned in the market segment outlook some of the challenges and uncertainty around the fronting market, perhaps some growing pains, if you will, but nonetheless, in AM Best view, the fronting partners have become a more integral and important part to the MGA business model. So that concludes my prepared presentation and remarks, and happy to move to any questions that we might have.
Thanks, Miles. We have got a few. You can probably see a couple of them, not all of them, in the chat facility, but I'll read the first one. This is a multi-part question, but I think it all relates, so I'll read the whole thing. Has the assessment been aligned to PRA/FCA outsourcing requirements? Has the assessment been aligned to Lloyd's DUA due diligence and cover holder audit requirements? And can the DUAE rely on the AM Best assessment output to satisfy carrier core requirements as a one-stop shop?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, I'll share some thoughts. Nick, if there's anything you want to add, then please chime in. So yeah, look, the first point I'd make is that the methodology has been designed on a global basis to be consistent across the global universe. So it is not intended to be tailored to individual market specific needs. And really what I'd point out is that it's not an audit. I think sometimes there is a bit of confusion that a performance assessment is an audit. It is a more holistic analysis of the 5 assessment components that I've mentioned. So with that said, it is important to note that there will be a lot of overlap, particularly in the context of your question there. A lot of the areas that the PRA, the FCA are looking at from a due diligence audit and sort of cover holder perspective, there will be a lot of overlap with the areas that we're evaluating in internal governance and controls. But it's not intended to be an audit that would satisfy all regulatory requirements applicable to MGAs in all markets. So hopefully that answers your question. And Nick, if you've got anything further you want to say, please chime in.
No, I think that's fair, Miles. As you say, it's the kind of global application which is the key. It may or may not meet some of these other requirements, and clearly we're supportive as much as anybody else to avoid duplication, but that's quite a panacea, I think.
Okay, and the next question I have is what kind of scenarios would be examples of things falling materially outside of expectations that would require the performance assessment to be reviewed?
Yeah, very good question. So I think this was linking back to the comments I made on the process page about an out of cycle update. Again, there can be a variety of things that would lead to that. The most common examples would be things such as a change in ownership that perhaps leads us to a position that we need to reevaluate some of the assessment components. So if the MGA previously had a very strong parent and it was up for sale and then subsequently sold, we would need to reevaluate that. There are also circumstances, perhaps where performance, if that was to be materially outside of expectations, considering that we would look at business plans and projections provided by an MGA, that could potentially lead us to a situation where we need to go back to an assessment committee out of cycle as well. So hopefully that gives you a few examples. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but really think about it in terms of sort of market or company specific events that would cause us to potentially need to update our assessment in those 5 key areas.
Thanks, Miles. Next question is there's sort of 2 elements to this, so I'll just read out the first one first. So regarding the alignment of interest, will you check MGA balance sheets and the operating expenses ratio and external acquisition costs, / brokerage versus minimum fixed premium they ask or get from a carrier?
Yeah, sorry, could you just say that again? I want to make sure I'm getting the question there.
Sure, and I think you should be able to hopefully see that in the chat as well. It's from Marcus Postle. So regarding the alignment of interest, will you check MGA balance sheets and the operating expenses ratio and external acquisition costs / brokerage versus minimum fixed premium they ask or get from a carrier?
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at alignment of interest, I mentioned that we sort of look at that from a couple of different perspectives. From a P&L and underwriting perspective in particular, we are very much interested in understanding the performance of the business, the acquisition costs that are being incurred, and how that then flows through to the commission structures that are in place. So I guess particularly focusing on commission structures, we'd look to understand how much commission is achieved through a fixed component versus a variable component, and how that ensures alignment of interest in terms of underwriting the business that the MGA is placing or binding on behalf of its partners. yeah, so hopefully that answers your question.
Great. And the second part from Marcus, I'm not sure, bearing in mind the disclaimer at the front, that you'll be able to answer the first part of this, but how you charge underwriting quality, especially for very niche business. And then it goes on, have you experienced underwriters who will review the underwriting guidelines of the MGA?
Yeah, and I'm assuming that the first part of the question is more how would we evaluate the underwriting quality for very small niches. And that's a very good question. I think there are both qualitative and quantitative considerations here. So some of it is proof in the pudding. If the performance, the loss ratios that flow through from a portfolio over a period of time are very favourable, that would be a quantitative indication of the performance of the business. But more qualitatively, things that we look at would include an evaluation of the underwriter's background and experience. So we'd look to understand past experience of underwriters, particularly when considering their ability to underwrite in very small niche product areas or segments of the market. And I think the second part was around sort of underwriting guidelines. To the comments we made earlier, this process does not lead us to a position where we evaluate every single contractual arrangement, an underwriting agreement that an MGA has with its partners. We would look at a sample of those, and we'd be looking to understand how the MGA and its underwriters execute their business in conjunction with those underwriting guidelines and requirements, and to ensure that there aren't breaches of underwriting guidelines as well. So that's something that would be front of mind when we're evaluating the underwriting quality and also the internal governance and controls as well. Thank
you. And that's the last of the questions, apart from one from Suzanne, who was only able to join halfway through and said, is it possible to share the slides, please? Yeah, we certainly will. As you've registered, we'll be sending out an email within the next few days that will contain the slides and also a link to the recording. So you needn't miss any of it. So yeah, that's all the questions. So Miles, Nick, thank you very much. I don't know if you've got any last comments before we wrap up.
We might just move on, Miles, as a final slide, I think. Yeah, just in terms of sort of follow up. So two other colleagues involved in this, particularly on the commercial side. So I think, as you said at the beginning, Tim, if for anyone who's interested in questions regarding pricing and fees, these are the people, not Miles, but William and Roisin are the people to follow up with. And apart from that, just to thank you again, Tim, and the MGA. I'm wondering if we can persuade you to change the name of your organisation to the DUAE or something. Maybe not. And yeah, thanks for everybody for joining us today.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Miles. I'll just give a quick recap of the learning objectives. So they were, at the end of this session, delegates will be able to summarise the 5 components of analysis in the AM Best Performance Assessment with the sub-factors in each category, explain how the overall performance assessment is developed, describe the performance assessment process and methodology, and outline the outcome of AM Best's initial performance assessments. So once again, thanks so much, Nick and Miles, for your session today, which I'm sure everyone will agree has been very interesting. And as Nick referred to, you can reach AM Best at the email addresses shown, or do feel free to contact me at tim.richards@mgaa.co.uk with any questions or introductions, and I'll be happy to pass those on. Thanks also to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to provide your feedback and do look out for forthcoming MGAA events. I hope you all have a productive afternoon. Thanks again for joining us and see you all soon.